Shalom, I am Rabbi Michael Panitz, speaking to you from the pulpit of Temple Israel of Norfolk, Virginia. I'd like to speak on the subject, Israel takes a step forward. People often wear names on their clothing, the name of a manufacturer, for example. As described in the biblical chapters we have been reading this past week in the book of Exodus, the high priest Aaron wore the name of God on a plaque attached to his turban. He also wore 2 epaulets on his shoulders, on which were inscribed the names of the 12 tribes of Israel. That's the role of the priest, to mediate between God and God's people. This is ancient history, but it gives us a way to frame an astounding development that has taken place in Israel just this week. Days ago, the Supreme Court of Israel took a stand to guarantee that the state of Israel live up to a promise it made at the time of its foundation in 1948. In the Israeli Declaration of Independence, Israel's founders pledged that the new state, quote, will ensure complete equality of social and political rights to all its inhabitants, irrespective of religion, race, or sex. While not perfect, by and large, Israel fulfills that pledge, especially with respect to religious rights. Israeli Muslims, Druze, Baha'i, and Christians have full freedom of religion. In sharp contrast to the low and defensive profile that Jews have always had to adopt in Muslim states ever since the 7th century, in Israel today one hears the muezzin calling the Muslim faithful to prayer 5 times a day with no fear of Israeli reprisal. Muslim houses of worship and Christian churches are scrupulously respected. There's only one exception: non-Orthodox Jews, Reform and Masorti, as the conservative movement is called in Israel. Reform and Masorti face not only ugly and often intense hostility from many Israeli Orthodox Jews, but they also face governmental discrimination. The discrimination takes several forms. Orthodox synagogues receive state funding. Non-Orthodox synagogues do not. This is an establishment of religion. And this establishment is the main obstacle to the growth of non-Orthodox Judaism, with the lamentable result that most Israeli Jews are largely secular and ignore the life-enhancing disciplines of Judaism altogether. They practice almost no religion, and yet, to use the famous turn of phrase, the religion that they do not practice is Orthodox Judaism. They hardly know the alternatives that would be such nourishment for their parched spiritual selves. The form of religious discrimination that was at the heart of this week's Supreme Court ruling deals with the definition of citizenship. As a natural consequence of being the one state in the world created to serve as a national home for the Jewish people, the young state of Israel passed the law of return. Under the provisions of that law, any Jew can come to Israel and immediately achieve Israeli citizenship. That includes both Jews born into the faith and also those who have converted to Judaism. But the Orthodox denomination has never accepted the legitimacy of conversion to Judaism accomplished under the guidance of non-Orthodox rabbis. This was leading to a major rift between the State of Israel and the Jews of all the world in the 1980s. The issue was headed off in 1989 by a state decision to allow Jews by choice converted outside of Israel under non-Orthodox rabbinic guidance to be treated as Jewish for the purposes of the law of return, although not for other purposes. But that recognition was not extended to converts to Judaism who trained and completed their journey into the Jewish fold within Israel itself. That is the background to the case just decided. In 2005, 12 people living in Israel who had become Jewish while there under Reform and Masorti auspices brought a petition to the Supreme Court of Israel to have the state recognize their status as Jews. After a decade and a half of refusing to decide, the court issued its ruling this week. Israel must recognize those petitioners as Jewish for the purposes of the law of return. The court was nearly unanimous, voting 8-1. The legal logic of the court's ruling is impeccable, since it builds soundly upon past precedent. Past Supreme Court decisions established that Jews who converted outside of Israel under non-Orthodox authority, provided they live in a recognized Jewish community, be recognized by Israel as Jews. In her opinion, the president of the court, Esther Hayut, explained that the current ruling is an application of this accepted principle. She wrote, "The petitioners came to Israel and went through a conversion process in the framework of a recognized Jewish community and asked to join the Jewish nation." If the legal issue is so clear, what took so long? The court had long delayed a ruling calling upon the government to devise a legislative solution, not wanting to legislate from the bench. But successive governments refused to do so, because no government was willing to stand up to the anti-democratic bloc of votes controlled by Orthodox political parties. After a decade and a half, the court recognized that justice delayed is justice denied. And it ruled that non-Orthodox conversions do indeed create a Jewish identity for the purposes of the application of the Israeli law of return. The religious discrimination against non-Orthodox Jews also produces an intolerable situation in marriage amongst Israeli Jews. The picture here shows exactly what is wrong with the establishment of one form of Judaism, Orthodox Judaism, as the state religion. The Israeli government enforces a situation in which a Muslim qadi may officiate at weddings of Israeli Muslims. A Catholic priest may officiate at weddings of Israeli Catholics. A Protestant pastor may officiate at weddings of Israeli Protestants. But a Masorti or Reform rabbi may not officiate at the wedding of non-Orthodox Jews, Israeli Jews. In 2018, the police hauled in Rabbi Dubi Hayun of the Masorti synagogue of Haifa and grilled him over his having officiated at a wedding of a couple denied permission to marry by the local branch of the Orthodox chief rabbinate. In fact, the Orthodox authorities investigated whether the woman was illegitimate in birth under a particular paragraph of ancient Jewish marriage law. And they were overly slow to come to a decision. So the young couple approached Rabbi Hayun, who researched the question and reached the conclusion that their marriage was acceptable according to the laws of Judaism. The Orthodox rabbinate took 2.5 years of dithering until it reached the same conclusion. But why was it so unresponsive to their desire to marry? Because it has a monopoly. This is precisely the abuse of power by religious functionaries as led our founding political thinkers, James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, the framers of our Constitution, to separate church and state in our Bill of Rights. Nearly 2.5 centuries later, the separation of synagogue and state would be good for Jews in Israel, and it would also be good in Judaism. It would remind the leaders and the bureaucrats of our religion that, like Aaron the high priest of old, they not only have on their forehead the sign dedicated to the Lord, they also wear on their epaulets the names of the Israelite tribes. One does not serve God by ignoring the legitimate needs of God's people. Shalom.